Hey, Katie. We have the clue of the broken locket. We are on chapter 3, Mistaken Identity. As the distraught girl vanished into the darkness, Nancy, Bess, and George stood still. They were completely puzzled. Was Cecily Curtis the red-haired young woman they had seen at the White Mill restaurant? But why would she run away from us? Bess asked. And what did she mean about the babies? George added. Nancy reminded the cousins that they were all assuming the young woman was Cecily Curtis. We ought to know soon, one way or the other. It's getting late. When the girls reached the cottage on the lakefront, they looked up to the opposite end of the lake, a scant half-mile away. A heavy mist shrouded it. Nancy guessed there might be hot springs in that area, which would account for the unusually heavy vapor. The moon was rising and revealed several cottages in the distance to their right. Suddenly Bess said, "Look up on the bluff about halfway to the far end of the lake. There's a big house with a light in the second floor. Somebody's staying there." "Maybe," said George, "it's an all-year home." As Nancy unlocked the door of the Baker cottage, Bess remarked, "It is eerie around this place. I'll be glad to get back to town." George said sternly, "Now, don't be imagining things." "Well, if I do," Bess retorted, "I'm in good company. Mrs. Hosking advised us not to come here, and Henry Winch, who isn't a fraidy cat, got enough of a scare to make him leave the lake." Nancy laughed. "At least the Baker cottage is okay. No ghosts here." She beamed her flashlight about the interior. The living room stretched across the front of the house and was comfortably furnished. Books and magazines on low tables and a huge fireplace gave the room a home-like atmosphere. George spotted a kerosene lamp and, with matches from the mantel-shelf, lighted it. "How cozy!" Bess exclaimed. "I'll bet it's wonderful in the summer with swimming and boating and everything. But why in the world would anybody want to come here alone this time of year?" "Fall is beautiful," George answered. "Maybe some people like to look at the fall foliage." The cottage was in perfect order, but the beds were not made and there was no food. Nancy built a fire in a wood stove in the kitchen, and Bess prepared cocoa. George soon had a fire roaring in the fireplace, and before long the chill of the cabin was gone. As the girls waited for Cecily, they talked about their experiences and concluded the day had been full of surprises. Finally, Nancy looked at her watch. "Do you realize it's 10 o'clock and Cecily hasn't come up yet?" "What'll we do?" Bess asked. "We can't sit up all night." Nancy suddenly proposed, "Why don't we sleep here? Cecily may not arrive until very late." This plan was agreed upon, although reluctantly on Bess's part. George offered to drive back to town and tell Mrs. Hosking of the girls' change in plans. "In the meantime, I'll make up some beds," Bess offered. "And if you don't mind," said Nancy, "I'd like to do a little investigating outdoors." Bess warned her to be careful, and Nancy said she would not go far. Just down to Henry Winch's dock. She rode that far with George, then got out of the car and went down the path towards the dock. To one side of it was a good-sized boathouse, and with moonlight streaming into the windows, Nancy could see motorboats, rowboats, and canoes. On the other side of the dock was the confectionery store with Mr. Winch's living quarters behind it. From the end of the dock, Nancy had a clear view of the whole lake, cottages, the large house on the bluff, and the mist-shrouded end of the lake. The young sleuth smiled to herself. "I wish that phantom boat would appear. I'd like to know what it looks like." But there was no sign of any ghostly vessel, and finally Nancy walked back to the cottage along a path near the lakefront. She heard a car coming and wondered whether it was George returning or Cecily Curtis arriving. She hurried up to the road to find out. The car proved to be her own, and in a moment George alighted. She had brought a few supplies which Mrs. Hosking had given her for the girls' breakfast. "I insisted upon paying her half for the food," said George, "and also a fair amount for holding our room." "I'm glad you did that," said Nancy. "We'd better take our bags," said George. They took them from the trunk, locked the car, then the two girls started in silence down the wooded path. They were about halfway to the cottage when suddenly they heard soft rustling in the bushes at the top of the slope above. The next moment something black shot past them. The The girls jumped, wondering what the object was. "Some animal, I think," said Nancy. "We must have scared it." The words were hardly out of her mouth when a high, clear voice called, "Satin, come back here!" Nancy and George turned. Somebody was starting down the path. It must be Cecily. The two girls set down their bags and started forward to greet her. Nancy called out, "Hello," as she beamed her flashlight up the hill. The girl from the White Mill restaurant again! But this time she was not wearing the raincoat and scarf. She had on the same outfit they had seen at the restaurant and was lugging 2 suitcases. "Oh, hello," she said pleasantly. "Well, this is a nice surprise. Are you vacationing here?" Nancy and George were confounded. Hadn't the newcomer recognized them? And why had she changed her clothes again? "Are you Cecily Curtis?" Nancy asked as the girls hastened to help her. "Yes, I am. But how did you know?" Nancy, though bewildered, decided to ask her questions, but she did notice the girl was not yet wearing a wedding ring. She introduced herself and George. "Mr. Winch is out of town, so we came here with the key to open the cottage for you." "How wonderful," Cecily said. "What is Satin?" George asked, taking one of the bags. "My big black cat. I dropped his carrying case and it opened. He zipped out of it like lightning." Nancy chuckled. "He flew right past George and me." Cecily stopped short. "I just recognized you both. It was so dark and I was so startled I didn't realize I'd met you at the White Mill. Imagine! Especially after you rescued me, Nancy. But there were 3 of you. What happened to the other girl?" "Bess Marvin is in the cottage making up beds," Nancy smiled. "Now that you're here, though, we'll go back to town for rooms." "Oh, I'd be delighted to have you stay," Cecily declared. "Really, I would. To tell you the truth, I'm pretty lonesome." "We'll accept with pleasure," said Nancy. By the time the 3 girls entered the cottage, at once Bess exclaimed, "I'm so glad you got here, Cecily. We were terribly worried. Why didn't you stay the first time you came?" Cecily looked at her blankly. "The first time? I haven't been here before." It was Bess's turn to look perplexed. "You mean you weren't up in the woods on your way here a few hours ago?" Cecily shook her head. "If you thought you saw me, I must have a double in the vicinity." She changed the subject. "I had an awful time getting to this cottage. A bus brought me to Misty Lake Village from Baltimore, and I tried to get a taxi to bring me here. Nobody wanted to, but finally one man agreed to drive me as far as the end of the lane. I had to lug these bags and my cat all the rest of the way." "You poor thing," Bess said sympathetically. Nancy, Bess, and George had agreed tacitly, so without talking. Not to mention having overheard Cecily and her fiancé talking. If she felt like telling them, however, they would be interested listeners. Nancy said, "Don't you think we'd better find Satin?" Cecily nodded, and the 4 took flashlights and went outside. Nancy gave the key to Cecily, who locked the cottage door. The girls began the search. Cecily kept calling the cat by name, but he did not come. "Oh dear," Cecily sighed. "Satin is such a comfort to me. I shall just die if he's gone." Without being sure where to look next, the girls finally turned right. They passed the neighboring cottages, then Henry Winch's dock, and continued along the lakefront toward the stone house atop the bluff. Cecily kept calling softly to her pet. Finally, George spotted 2 glowing eyes peering from behind a tree and whispered to Cecily, "I bet that's Satin." "Here, kitty, kitty," Cecily said quietly. "Come here, Satin." Reluctantly, the big black cat came toward her. She scooped him up in her arms and patted him affectionately. Through the stillness of the woods, Nancy detected a strange sound. "Listen," she said quickly. They all stood motionless. Amid the chirps of a myriad crickets and the hoots of an owl, the girls could hear a steady humming noise. It was not far from them. What could it be?